Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. If I sound either amped up or tired, it's because I've just finished, like literally moments ago, finished recording the solo and out of the frying pan into the fire with one of my favorite people and a recent fan favorite, since he's only been on once before, Michael Moynihan. He's the co-host of the podcast, The Fifth Column, as many of you probably know, very popular podcast. All the best people are listening to it, people are saying. And he's just started something called the Moynihan Report, which I and 6 other people get the reference on the two-way. So, Mike Moynihan, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thanks for having me, Jonah.
So, want to get just like the rank punditry out of the way, and then we can...
Yeah, I mean, it was, I will say one thing before, just because it's fresh in my mind, and I'm in Brooklyn right now, and I was just in a coffee shop, and I was waiting to get my coffee, and I didn't hear the beginning of this conversation, but the woman that was checking out said to the guy, who she clearly knew behind the counter, said, you know, and I just couldn't do it because it was so fascist. And he was like, yeah, no, I know. And that was the transaction. And I was like, this is why I live in Brooklyn. I don't know what was fascist, but that was just said about 45 seconds before I got on this microphone. So yeah, there you go.
I prefer it from Barcelona, the movie, where
yes,
facha. It just it makes it seem so much more, you know.
And if you haven't seen it, one of the great movies, which I saw about a week before I first moved to Europe, nice. And it really jarred me. I said, "Wait, is it really?" Well, I'm going to have to talk about the AFL-CIA, which is.
And I got to say, I mean, again, we have failed to show any discipline here very early.
Sure.
But for listeners who haven't seen the movie, first of all, shame on you. But there's this great riff in it where they're explaining anti-Americanism and why they think Americans are horrible people, and it's because of hamburguesas, which is the Spanish for hamburgers. And the problem is, and you find this in Europe, it's absolutely true, they don't know how to make hamburgers. Charlie Cook talks about this all the time, about how when he was at Oxford, all the Americans were like, the first thing I'm going to do when I get home is have a hamburger. And Charlie would be like, we have hamburgers here. And it's like, no, but your hamburgers suck.
Yes.
And so because Spanish hamburgers suck, they think Americans are idiots for loving hamburgers. But the fact is, the hamburgers Americans love aren't the crappy hamburgers you can get in Spain. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think the mimicry of American stuff in Europe accounts for a big chunk of snobbery towards America. But the problem is that the imitation American stuff in Europe stinks.
Yes.
So I would have snobbery towards Americans too.
There's another version of this too. It kind of runs parallel to it. It's that Americans are I first went to Europe in the 90s, and it's a kind of different thing then. And the anti-Americanism was very, very strong at the time. And then, of course, I moved to Sweden about a week before the Iraq War started, which was very unfortunate for me. But the thing that I noticed when I was in England in the 90s was that people didn't like Americans because we were smarter than them when it came to being ruthless capitalists. So we would sell them the worst shows that we had. Right. Showing us in the absolute worst light. It would be Jerry Springer. They later had a guy named Jeremy Kyle who was like an imitator. But before that, it was Jerry Springer and stuff. And we got Alistair Cook. Right. So it was like the trade-off. And it was like, when they heard that we had Benny Hill, they sneered. No, to Benny Hill, absolutely not. But all we got was Masterpiece Theater. And they got every bit of shitty American culture. Well, we were just counting our stacks of bills and they were hating us because of it. So I think there's a part of it.
It's true. It's also like, it's a concept that you're explaining to the youngins today. You would say straight to Netflix kind of movies.
Correct. Yeah.
But like straight to video.
Straight to video. Yeah.
Where, back in our day, the really crappy Highlander sequels and stuff or whatever, they were just bad movies.
Yeah.
Would get unloaded throughout Europe, and people think this is what American movies are, and it's like Americans don't go to see these movies.
Correct. You would always have to look at the international box office, because it made $7 here. Carrot Top Goes to the Circus or something, and then it did very, very, very well in like Transnistria, and it's like, oh, okay, that's good.
Although I will tell you, it was really interesting. I liked the Police Squad movies. I mean, I legitimately liked them. At least the first couple of them.
Police Academy, you mean?
Police, no.
Police Squad. Oh, Police Squad. Yeah.
Frank Drebin.
Yeah. The show was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the Police Squad was the name of the show, but whatever the
Naked Gun,
right? And I remember I was living in Prague, not as long as, but I was there at the same time as Matt Welch, your colleague. Yeah. And I went to go see one of the Naked Gun movies, and it was funny, but people were falling out of their chairs laughing, and it was unbelievable. And it was explained to me later that it was in communism with the Czechs. Obviously, you didn't do Polish jokes, right? And you couldn't do communist jokes because you got in trouble. So local police were the stupid people. And there was probably some truth to that, because like, if you had the chops to be a good cop, you'd go into the Communist Party and be like a KGB type,
like an SB agent, yeah.
But if like you were just somebody's nephew, you became a patrolman or whatever. And so movies making fun of policemen were considered the height of comedy, which I just thought was kind of really interesting.
The Jerry Lewis of communism.
All right, so. Speaking of which, let's get back to the rank punditry and the Jerry Lewis of capitalism. Donald Trump has not had a great April. We are recording on April 25th. No. Liberation Day was April 2.
Yeah.
Curious. Can you think of another time in American history, or this is a harder part of it, but you might be better at this than I am, in the history of a stable, advanced democracy, right? So like not Idi Amin just printing money, right? But a stable, advanced democracy of a president or a prime minister or a leader so single-handedly doing so much gratuitous damage to their own economy?
You know, it's funny because I heard someone say this the other day about Milei, is that, you know, Donald Trump has all these good things to say about Milei. People in MAGA world have good things to say about Milei. I have good things to say about Milei. But, you know, the people saying this are Peronists. And, you know, and on the other hand, you have a guy who's destroying Peronism, which has infected Argentina for so long and destroyed the economy for so long. No, I mean, even if you look at the polling, I mean, you cannot, and I actually did this the other day because someone said it, and I don't trust anything anyone says. So I go and was going through as many.
You're a handsome man. I want to tell you that right
now. Yeah, I mean, almost everything. And I was looking at, you know, the first 100 days. And of course, the only person prior to Donald Trump who had such low approval ratings in the first 100 days was Donald Trump in his first administration. And he's actually bested that at, you know, about 40%, 39, 40, 41%. And so those first 100 days, just in a popularity, I mean, you usually get that, you know, George W. Bush in 2000, I think was at about 60% after his first 100 days. And yeah, so, I mean, I have never seen somebody take what they believe to be, and this is the thing that I find so crazy and so discomforting about all the people in MAGA world, is the idea that a mandate, what that means, right? So Elon Musk kept on tweeting about judges making bad decisions, what he thought were bad decisions, and saying, you know, but he has a mandate. We can't allow this. I mean, the man has such a sweeping mandate. And I realized then that winning the popular vote, which nobody in MAGA world expected, had this very weird effect on them. That they believed that they won the popular vote by 80%, that it was like a Syrian election or something. And it's like, no, it was very, very close. And what has happened, you know, and you find these people, there's one of these guys, who's the one that has that embarrassing name, who all the MAGA people love on Twitter, cat shit or something, cat turd. Yes. Cat turd. No, but I love that it's cat turd 2, not to be confused with cat turd 1, who's a little more moderate. But this guy had tweeted something in 2020, you know, Congress has done nothing, you know, the President Biden is ruling by executive order. And then that sort of disappears, and Congress at this point doesn't seem to exist. And we live in a monarchy in some weird way where the king is just signing all these executive orders. And
Congress is like Richie Cunningham's older brother. He's just been written out of the show.
Yes,
you know,
it's when what was it? The Dukes of Hazzard, they got Coy and Vance
that's right. During contract negotiations for a whole season. Yes.
Bo and Mook were replaced by Coy and Vance, which is just amazing. But no, I mean, that is a thing that I fear that we're getting very used to, because even people that I know have the right views about this concentration of presidential power, and just beyond that, the crazy, like the just legitimately crazy things that the president is doing. There's so much, and it's the Steve Bannon flood the zone with bullshit, right? Flood the zone with shit, because there's so much shit, it's really impossible to keep up. And that, I said this the other night to somebody. We were talking about CBS and this Sherry Redstone stuff, and the guy from 60 Minutes resigning and saying he's being pressured and everything. And I pointed out that I don't want to call anyone out in particular, you probably go find it, but on election night, I was hosting for the Free Press. And I had a bunch of people around me on the couch when we were kind of talking. And I pointed out that no one seemed to care. And the people in the free speech side of the ledger, who considered them the free speech warriors during the anti-woke stuff, weren't really saying anything that the president had launched a $10 billion, in a very Austin Powers way, $10 billion lawsuit against 60 Minutes for an interview that he was not even in. He's not even involved in. And people who didn't understand TV, I've done TV for a very long time. You shoot an hour interview, you got to cut it down to 15 minutes. And then they released the whole thing, and it was like, okay, that was a totally normal cut. Yeah. And that, when I said that before he won the election, it got like no reaction. Yeah. Nobody was like, that's a problem. And I said, no, this is going to be much worse if he becomes president. And then, of course, the law firm stuff, which is absolutely terrifying. The pressure on various media organizations, like, this is just bad stuff. I mean, just objectively bad stuff. And it has, of course, nothing to do with conservatism. And I can't, it's shocking to me that people on the right, and not the ones that just came to the right through MAGA, these kind of trans conservatives who switch, the Stephen Moores of the world or the Larry Kudlows of the world, who were free traders until they get a job in the administration. They're not anymore. That stuff is like, how do you even find any echo in conservatism with this stuff? I just don't understand it at all.
Yeah. So obviously you're singing from my hymnal about a lot of this stuff. So but I want to just circle back to the mandate thing for a second, because this is like, as you know, in our line of work, one of the things you do is you sort of acquire new intellectual grievances about things, and eventually it
the Festivus of jobs. Yes.
Yeah. But it's sort of like, don't even get me started on Harold Ickes and the wiping out of the pigs. Like you have these things, and it's a normal human thing. People
the Schechter case is
or like, but people have it for sports. It's like there's certain people, like, the second you say Babe Ruth is better than Ted Williams, you better clear your calendar, because you got all day, right?
Correct.
And the idea of a mandate, which I've never really focused on much until the last 10 years or so, is one of the most illiberal, dangerous, stupid, anti-constitutional concepts that is routinely bandied about by both sides, right? There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about a mandate.
Yeah.
The only mandate you actually have is to get the job you were elected to do, and then to get a chance to do it, right? So Donald Trump has a mandate to be president. Adam Schiff won in the same election to be a senator. He has a mandate to be a pain in the ass in Donald Trump's, pain in Donald Trump's ass. Like, he does not owe Donald. There's no reason for him to defer to the electoral presidential majority.
Yeah.
If he got elected too, he's elected to be a senator. I hate Adam Schiff, right? But like, that's not my point. And the thing is everything sounds scarier in German, but like, the mandate thing is basically this idea of a plebiscitary mandate to just do whatever you want because that's how you got elected. First of all, it assumes that every single person who pulled a lever for Trump or filled in an oval for Trump voted for him to declare war on law firms, which I just don't think is remotely plausible.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's sort of like people were saying it's an insult to the 74 million people who voted for Trump if you impeach him. Well, no one voted for him to do January 6th because it hadn't happened yet. But anyway, my point is, if you just said, it would be just great if you could go through the transcripts of Face the Nation or Meet the Press, and anytime someone says mandate, you just said Volksgemeinschaft.
Yeah.
You know, because it's the same. It's just the spirit, the voice of the people, that kind of stuff. And the whole point of a written constitution is to say, and separation of powers is to say, no. These are the delineated powers that people have. And just because you won by a big margin, and never mind that you only won by 1.48% of the vote, does not mean that you have extra power to do crap that the Constitution doesn't let you do.
Yeah, and I mean, look, the German thing is fun and funny, and I don't want to in any way suggest that I think this administration is Nazi-like. I don't think it is at all. I think it's, a kind of petty authoritarian kind of, it's a caudillo kind of thing. It's a kind of South American thing.
I don't want to throw you off on this, but I think we talked about this a little bit last time. How like people only know World War II and Vietnam for historical analogies. When it comes to war, and people only know Hitler when talking about dictators. I can't remember. If we didn't talk about it, I want to talk about it. I agree with you. He's not Hitler, right? My standard joke is he's not Hitler. Hitler could have repealed Obamacare. But the issue is, who is he most like? And I've been on a Juan Perón kick of late.
Yes,
but if you've got a better one, I'm open to it.
Well, it's not too far from that, and I will say quickly on that. I think he's a Chavista. I think he's very Hugo Chavez-like, because I mean, what did the Chavistas do? Maduro became the much more dictatorial figure after Chavez died, but Chavez tried to do it in a kind of legal way. So, when television stations were attacking him, he refused to renew their broadcast license. Right. So there was a time when, if you were poor in Venezuela, there's a lot of poor people in Venezuela who didn't have internet access in the 2000s, or they didn't have cable television. They only had these 4 or 5 channels that were all, pro Chavez, or they were going off the air. They wouldn't be able to show their soap operas, right, and make all this money. And I think there's, like, when it comes to media and things like that, it's like, well, I'm not going to ignore the courts so much. I'm going to, play with it. I'm going to, give lip service to it. But there's a Chavista kind of, caudillo thing to it. But that's what my reason I said that is that when you said Volksgemeinschaft, I thought one of the other things that you could potentially say is Gleichschaltung, which
another one of my favorite terms. Yeah.
And that's the like synthesis of all the ideas, bringing everybody in line with the correct view. And you see, I said on the podcast the other night to Matt Welch, is that I never knew this person existed, but now I'm a huge Don Bacon fan. because he's the one that resists the Gleichschaltung. It's just like, you know what? No, I don't think this is good for X, Y, and Z reason. And that kind of bringing together, and we probably called synchronization or something is what that would probably mean, that's what the Republican Party has done. I mean, we did an episode, went online yesterday, and I'm getting a lot of flack for it because we had Batya Ungar Sargon on, and I had a couple drinks before we started. I'll just acknowledge that.
Fair.
It did get very shouty. I got very, very mad at certain points, and I personally like Batya. There's nothing against her, but I think that everything she says about this stuff is loony. But at one point during it, she said, which I thought really I didn't even talk about it, because the thing about it is, and this when you host a podcast, and particularly when you're hosting a debate, and there's 4 people in the room, you're going to get a bunch of emails that say, why didn't you do this? Why interviewing, debating, it's about picking and choosing your targets, particularly when it's so target rich. And one of the things I didn't mention, but was pretty amazing to me, when Batya referred to somebody as a rhino, and it was a person that struck me, I can't remember who it was, struck me as probably more conservative than anybody in the White House, because rhino has now shifted its meaning to being Republican in name only, meaning that they're not a MAGA type.
Right.
Which was the first time I heard that.
Yeah. Insufficiently committed to Trump is like the best working definition. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a kind of, I hadn't really, when I think of rhinos, right? That's not what I'm. That's not.
Right.
I'm thinking about the old, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski,
Arlen Specter was the
Arlen
original
Specter,
rhino.
great example of a rhino, right? That's a rhino, and people who didn't sufficiently believe in the power of the free market. That's what I always thought of it. So yeah, it is a very odd place to be, and I just don't think. And this might precipitate a bigger and longer discussion if we want to have it, but I don't think that this can last. This iteration of the Republican Party, I don't think it can last. And the reason I don't think it can last, because all the promises from the first term, this is what we're going to do for Main Street as opposed to Wall Street. There were things, I did a documentary for HBO about Trump's trade war. And, small beer compared to what we're seeing now. But when none of this delivers any results, because it won't. It's impossible for it to deliver results. There's going to be a point where the American people, who I still believe are sensible people, and I believe there are desperate people, and sometimes when they're convinced that they should be desperate, because it's always the same thing with the American people. It's like when you poll them about healthcare. My healthcare is amazing. Everybody else's is terrible. Right.
My kid's school is awesome, but the schools are in terrible shape.
Correct. That is the same thing. Like, are people hurting that bad? There's a certain element of American people, of course, who are, but that everyone, that the working class has been torn asunder, and we have low unemployment. I mean, Scotland Sickham always points out, we have 140,000 manufacturing jobs that are open right now, and nobody applying for those jobs, nobody taking those jobs. But when there's like a limited return on these very, very big promises, not small on the margin, big promises, I think that's ultimately. I mean, people say things like, Trumpism and MAGA can't outlast Donald Trump because he's the man behind it. He's the genius behind it. He's this great kind of communication style, and people like it. He's funny, etc. I think the policies, now that they're being put in place, are going to be an amazing disappointment to people, and I think that will ultimately destroy this version of the Republican Party. I think it'll take a long time, and I think there's other factors too, but I think that's a big one, particularly with the tariff stuff.
Yeah, and I don't dispute that. I guess I see it a little differently, though. I think, first of all, we've never really come up with good labels for all of this, right? So, like, core MAGA is not going anywhere, because
no.
That's the core personality cult, is a personality cult, right? And so it is immune to a lot of things, and to a lot of facts. But then there's a big chunk of people who, and I'm sure we know a lot of them, I'm sure you know a lot of them, I know a lot of them. There are people who really didn't like Kamala Harris, who voted for Trump anyway, because they voted against Harris more than for Trump, but they convinced themselves, a lot of Wall Street guys, right, a lot of private equity guys, they convinced themselves that pre-COVID Trump didn't do anything too bad, and that we'll get a replay of that. And so, the way I've been phrasing it is, the mistake that they made was thinking that the best case scenario was also the most likely scenario.
Yeah.
And that said, I think the problem with, I agree with you. Part of the problem is, the Republican Party can't last the way it is, but neither can the Democratic Party. So something's going to give, right?
Yeah.
So,
who seem to not exist at the moment. Yeah.
But the problem, I think, is that, and you're free to disagree, but core MAGA is your basic populist movement, right? It's cult of personality kind of thing. And what populists do, regardless of ideological or economic agenda, is they tell you, I can satisfy your heart's desire because it's so easy, right? Mm-hmm. It'd be so easy to end the Ukraine war. I could do it in a day. I can do it. So easy to do this, so easy to do that. Everyone else is stupid. It's so easy. Bernie Sanders, so easy to give you Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm.
I could do it. The only reason you can't have it is because sinister forces are preventing that from happening. Millionaires and billionaires, right? In other contexts at other times, the only reason you can't have all the nice things is because the Jews. right now,
That's
Trump
also happening today, Jonah.
That is also happening today, and we'll come to that. But Trump is setting up an argument to say we could do all of these things if it weren't for these radical rogue judges, right?
Yeah.
And so the danger with Trump's coming failure economically or unfolding failure economically is there is simply no way he's going to take the blame for it, right? He is going to put it on someone else. He's already saying, Wall Street Journal doesn't like tariffs because it's pro-China, right? All these hedge fund guys are they're secretly pro-China and anti-American. And that's a really dangerous prospect going forward, right? And this is why I've always hated populism from any side, when it devolves into this argument that it's really easy to give you what you want, because when they fail, if it was easy, they shouldn't have failed. So the only explanation for why they failed is because sinister forces, big corporations, millionaires and billionaires, Jews, the Egg Council, whoever, are stopping it from happening. And they create a class of people to demonize. And we have not lived in a time where we're used to the left's attack on judges. And it's bad, but it's always been kind of effete and elitist and that kind of thing, and institutionalist. The populist right's attack on judges could get very, very, very ugly.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, a couple of things about this. I mean, some of it depends on how much people are paying attention. Because if they're paying attention at all, the less that people pay attention, the more those appeals to, Jews and the Klaus Schwab and all this stuff, that makes a lot more sense when you don't pay attention at all. But I think there's something that if you're paying even the slightest bit of attention, you hear Donald Trump say no carve-outs this time around for tariffs, and then how does it benefit Main Street as opposed to Wall Street when you have Tim Cook talking to people in the administration getting a carve-out for Apple? Multi-billion-dollar corporation gets a carve out, and they can import stuff, and your iPhones won't be, $4,000. The fact that Scott Bessent is talking to Wall Street and saying, "Hey, we're going to ease up on these tariffs," and then trading goes crazy, and people are making billions of dollars off of this. They're giving tip-offs to these people in Wall Street. I mean, this is more Wall Street than Main Street than any administration I've seen in a very long time. I mean, that kind of synthesis between, and it's not just like the Bill Ackmans and these people. But by the way, I just want to give credit to one person. Cliff Asness is the best. And he's hilarious. And the man who is waging this lonely billionaire battle, because all the other billionaires are like, Gleichschaltung. We're going to get involved, and Cliff just doesn't give a shit. And I think he's one of the smartest and funniest guys. But yeah,
full disclosure, we should just for listeners who don't really appreciate it, I hold the Cliff Asness Chair in Applied Liberty at the American Enterprise Institute.
Oh, you do? Oh, great.
I do. And
I didn't know that.
Cliff is a very dear friend of mine. We were both comic book geeks, and I text with him often.
Oh, so good. I've had the opportunity to sit with him at a few dinners and stuff, and I've found him unbelievably entertaining. And I just love his Twitter feed. He's like the best guy out there. But yeah, I think that is true, and it is true with these kind of dark, shadowy forces. And people listen to the podcast that we put out the other day. I asked Batya, and the reason I bring her up is that because she is the most vehement defender of the Trump agenda out there. And I said, does it bother you that 98% of economists disagree with about everything you're saying? And, I think this is one of those weird holdovers from COVID. This is one of the worst things about COVID, besides the mass death, was this idea that no one can be trusted anymore, including 98% of economists, including historians. These are the elites. They're lying to. They're always going to be lying to. And the response from her was something to that effect. I mean, these are the people that benefit. These are the people that are making all the money. I'm like, they're academic economists. Are they really making all this money? You really believe that? But, it is... there is some hope. The saddest thing about this administration is who Elon Musk actually is. Because on paper, in a very narrow way, he could have been the bulwark against some of the crazy shit. Because he loves Milton Friedman. He posts Milton Friedman quotes and videos, and Tom Sowell. He's like, he has a free market kind of outlook, but he's also a lunatic, and he posts other totally insane things. And Doge is great on paper. You like the idea of it. I mean, Matt Welch and I had talked about this, that the Wall Street Journal editorial that I guess Vivek Ramaswamy wrote, quote unquote, wrote with Elon Musk was on the merits very good. I was like, yeah, that's pretty great. And then no, it's you can't trust this administration to do anything right. But yeah, I think that the cult of personality stuff, the kind of Juche conservatism is what I've taken to calling it, because it has this kind of North Korean. Somebody has to make a supercut of both people in the administration sitting around a large oak desk with Donald Trump at it, being a sycophant in the increasing sycophancy. It's insane. It's like actually insane to watch. And the same thing is true about these new media outlets, alternative media outlets in the press briefings, who are like, is Donald Trump the best leader of all time or the best leader for the world ever? And it's like, well, thank you for the question. Like, this kind of stuff is so, that when you talk about the cult of personality is really, it's really deep, obviously, but can that survive without a Donald Trump? Because as you've probably noticed, Jonah, there's a number of people in quote unquote conservative world that are doing Donald Trump impressions, like very bad ones.
Yeah, very bad.
And Pete Hegseth is a great example of this. You know, like they ask him about, you know, the signal stuff, and he's on the White House lawn and he's like, you losers in the mainstream media. That never existed before Donald Trump, that you would insult the media to their faces for your base, and to no great end. It's not illuminating in any way. So, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about how listening to podcasts requires picking your battles and following one line on another. I just want the record to show that I have been heroic in my chivalric equanimity by not taking the bait about Baccha at all.
Yes.
I think right-wing MAGA is terrible, but left-wing MAGA is just about the dumbest, most unpersuasive garbage I have ever heard. And I'll just leave it at that. But you brought up this thing about the sort of new media going into the White House. This is a point of personal privilege to a certain extent. The other day on Twitter, the usual suspects were praising Tim Pool for calling out the media. He's got the new media chair in the briefing room, and the White House press secretary was talking about what a great guy Pool is and how he's brilliant and all these wonderful things. And Pool has this reputation for being transgressive and calling out the elites and being a rebel and all that kind of thing. And he asked this sort of head past the sphincter, ass kissing question that could have been literally written by the comm shop at the White House that attacked the media and talked about how awesome Trump is.
Which wasn't really a question. You have to tack on a question at the end to make it seem like a question. It's a statement.
Right. Yeah, it's like, how do you compensate with being so awesome when these people suck so bad, right? That was the gist of it. And the thing is, so I criticized it, not because it was partisan, because I'm kind of done, like we're just, that ship has sailed, right? Partisan media is a thing now. But that this guy's supposed to be this rebel who speaks truth to power, and here he is given this amazing opportunity, and all he does is suck up to power. And the response from people, including like some dudes at like Red State, was like, yeah, just like the Washington Post and New York Times during Biden. And the thing is, I'm fine with criticizing the mainstream media and how they covered Biden. Fine with complaining about the cover up of his age and all that. Fine. That's all fine. All fair game, all legit. The idea that the New York Times and the Washington Post didn't ask any tough questions of the Biden White House is just ignorant nonsense, right? Did they not ask enough? Did they not ask them sooner? That's all fine. And I tried to make this point that, like, first of all, you're wrong on the facts. But even if you weren't wrong on the facts, your complaint is that it's wrong for the media to suck up to the people in power unless it's your team in power. And then you're like, this is awesome. And the other side because they did it, even though they didn't really do it the way they describe, gives us permission to do it too. And like, this is, in very small microcosm, kind of how democratic legitimacy and stability dies, when each side takes the worst version of the other side as permission to be even worse when they get back in power.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to it, but the fact that people can't see that, like, if you think obsequious fawning coverage from the media is bad when you don't like the president, just because you like the president doesn't mean you should like fawning and obsequious coverage all of a sudden, particularly from a guy who's not really a journalist anyway.
Yeah, and you know, to be met with the whataboutism immediately and say, well, what about the Biden administration? Well, you know, I host a podcast with Camille Foster and Matt Welch, in which we spent 4 years beating the tar out of the media for exactly how they were handling the Biden stuff. So we're pretty consistent on these things. But, you know, the argument has often been, and I don't really like this argument. There's times when I entertained it, but, you know, Trump is, first term in particular, you know, he does what everybody does. He's just not very smooth about it. He's just really out in the open about it. That intrigued me for a bit. Not any longer.
There's definitely some truth to it.
There's definitely some truth to it, for sure. But now it's we've gone so far past that. But I always point out might even last time I was on, the speech that Tucker Carlson gave at CPAC, and I think it was at that speech when he was founding the Daily Caller. And go back and listen to it. It's a fantastic speech. Very, very well done. Tucker is, I don't know what happened to him, and that's 8 extra shows, but he is a smart guy and was a very good journalist at one point, was a very good writer, was a good magazine journalist, a good profiler. And that version of Tucker was up on stage and he mentioned the New York Times, lustily booed by the CPAC crowd, which is, you know, you hit the buzzer and it shocks them in the seat and they start booing because the New York Times. And he says, no, don't boo the New York Times. They're liberal. We know they're liberal, but they do good work and they try to get the story right. And that is not the Tucker that you would see today.
No.
And I imagine he would argue that things have devolved since then, particularly. And I guess that argument I'm hearing so much from people who are very MAGA and very mad at me is, you know, they tried to put him in jail. They tried to kill him. Some fucking lunatic in Pennsylvania, but they tried to kill him. They tried to put him in jail and all this stuff. So it's much, much different now. But, you know, I mean, Tim Pool and these people should realize that they have shows. They have radio shows, they have television shows, they have YouTube shows because of the work of the mainstream media.
Right.
Both complaining about it and using their reporting.
Yeah.
What's happening in, you know, tariff negotiations? What's happening with Pete Hegseth? What's happening with Doge and the State Department? That's all coming from mainstream media. That does not mean I don't have endless criticism of the mainstream media. I mean, I've made a career out of having
me too.
You know, it's like, please. But it's not this binary thing. They're either perfect or they're terrible. There's something in between. And I said this again the other night, is I like the fact that there's a new media chair and it shouldn't be these, you know, ossified institutions, CBS, ABC, NBC, PBS, and that's it. And then the newspapers, but the Dispatch is never going to get in there.
Nope.
You know, that's not what it's about. I like the idea. I like having these new people. You know, it's great. I mean, Donald Trump did something brilliant during the campaign. And I think from somebody I know who was kind of close to this universe, that it was a Barron Trump's idea that he go on Theo Vaughn. He go on Joe Rogan. He go on Andrew Schultz. That was brilliant. And because these are big media platforms that are talking to people that are not watching PBS NewsHour or something. But also when he was on Theo Vaughn, it was the only time I saw the president be an actual human. And there was that moment, that clip that everyone saw, in which he starts interviewing Theo Vaughn about addiction. Because there's addiction in his family, his brother. And it was like a moment where you're like, oh, that's an actual... He's not just an actor. I mean, he is an actor, but there's a moment of kind of humanity there. And that stuff was really useful for the campaign, right? And so I understand kind of rewarding these things, but this throwing the baby out with the bathwater about mainstream media, it's like, look, when Trump people say to me, well, we have so many overlaps in issues. I say, no, we don't. Like, writ large, yeah, the mainstream media sucks. But what you want to do is you want to Nagasaki the media, whereas I want the Gurkhas to go in and slit a few throats and then get out.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, no, it's like sort of like the stuff with Harvard, right?
Yeah,
I find it very difficult to have, like, whenever I get asked about it on TV, I kind of dread it because I think a lot of the criticisms are well founded, and like
completely.
Harvard, I think someone said, you know, it's like the framing a guilty man kind of thing. I don't like the tactics from the administration. I don't like the blunderbuss approach, but at the same time, like, Harvard should have checked itself before it wrecked itself a long time ago, and so I just don't have a clear narrative on it in a lot of ways, and I do think there are some real constitutional free speech things going on with it. So you read a riff on the Harvard stuff, but I do want to sort of, it does cue up a different point, which is, I got into this little thing with Chris Rufo, who I think is a more serious person than Batya and some other people. Like at least I think he's trying to have a consistent through line on all this. And there are times when I'm in total agreement with the guy, and there are times when I'm definitely not. But
and he's effective. We'll give him that too.
He can be effective. I mean, I thought the way he handled they're eating the pets stuff in Ohio was terrible. And it wasn't effective. But then there's other stuff that is very effective, you know. So but the Wall Street Journal had this piece about how the new right, and I made this point with Bonson the other day, and I should make it here as well. There are many rooms in the mansion of the new right, and there have been many new rights in the history of the right. And I don't think there are serious people on the new right who are not well served by being under the flag of the new right, because there are also a lot of bonkers, bigoted, horrible people that get called new right too, right? So like Patrick Deneen and Candace Owens are different creatures with different arguments and live in different moral universes, right? Dave Smith, who you got me into all sorts of trouble because we talked about him last time, and he went nuts on Twitter about me.
Nuts on Twitter. I didn't read any of this because the reason, I just interrupt you quickly, I didn't read any of this, and because it drives me crazy, and then I get bogged down and I just don't want to. But I was told that he did like 20 minutes on his podcast playing the clip of us, and he got apparently very angry that I forgot his name.
Yeah, and I think that was the gist of it or something. Yeah,
but which is odd, and I just want to clarify if Dave Smith is, you know, hunting for more content for his podcast. I forget. I'm getting old. I forget everyone's name all the time.
Oh, I do it constantly.
And some Camille, I think it was Camille told me. He said his name's Dave Smith, and it's like, no, the more common the name, more likely. I mean, like, his name's John Smith. Like, I'm just not paying attention, and it's no offense to Dave Smith, so I apologize. On that front, I disagree with you on everything, but I apologize on that front.
I do that all. It's amazing. It's as you get older, the analogy I always use is it's sort of like, you know, when you drop something, say, between the console and your chair in your car, and the reaching to get it pushes it further away, right? So like literally, like yesterday, I had to Google Dana Perino's name. I've known Dana Perino for 20 years.
Yeah.
But like by the mere act of looking for it, I pushed it out of my head. You
Correct.
know? Anyway.
Yeah.
But so all those caveats aside about the new right, like, you know, Adrian Vermeule and Dave Smith are different creatures, right? And we don't need to revisit Dave Smith in any great detail. But the Wall Street Journal had this piece, you know, which was basically a profile of Rufo, about the new right's love affair with Antonio Gramsci.
Yeah, it's crazy.
and this whole long march to the institutions thing. And I had a civilized back and forth with Rufo about it, but I hate this crap. Right, I'm really interested in Gramsci. I like and Gramsci was not one of the Italian elite theorists, but he's associated with them. Like, he wasn't Pareto or Michel's or those guys. But like, there is really just no argument in my mind for elevating a Stalinist communist who was wrong about everything.
Yeah.
For being the Rosetta Stone about how to seize power. He didn't even coin the phrase "the Long March Through the Institutions." It's associated with him. And so I'm just kind of curious, because you're like one of the few guys out here, like you and Eli Lake and a handful of other people, Nick Gillespie, I can think of, Jonathan Adler. I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, but like there are a handful of people who just hold these grievances and these intellectual paper on these various obscure figures and stuff. I'm just kind of curious where you come down on all
that. Yeah, it's a tough one. It didn't surprise me. I mean, I expressed surprise when I was like, yeah, Gramsci, that's kind of crazy. But it doesn't really surprise me, considering, it was in 2016 or something that I think it was our mutual friend Ron Radosh who had written a piece for the Daily Beast about how Steve Bannon told him that he was a Leninist. And so that doesn't really surprise me that much. But from what I gather about Rufo, to bring it into the present, is that people like Chris Rufo can attack me and say that I'm wrong, and I hope that he clarifies if I am wrong. But I've been observing him for a bit, and I will say the same thing that you said. He's a very smart guy, and his book, though I can't remember the name of it, but somebody told me, look at his book, because he seems not really unserious on the internet, but willing to go to any lengths to win and become like, DeSantis's hatchet man at the college in Florida that they took over, basically. But I looked at his book, and it was pretty good. There was some pretty impressive stuff in it. He understands the issues. He understands the people. That's what kind of makes me a little suspicious, or maybe even surprised, that he said these things about Gramsci. But Bannon, I get when it comes to Lenin, because Bannon isn't thinking of, what is the kind of schism when you see Leninism and Stalinism next to each other, or, Bukharin. I mean, he's not thinking about these things. He's thinking that Lenin took power by hanging kulaks and destroying the institutions. And that's what we need to do. Rufo, I think I was a bit more surprised, because I give him a bit more credit. I mean, Bannon, I find very interesting. I've interviewed him a couple of times. I might even mention the fact that it was the only interview that I ever stopped because it went on too long. It was like my camera guys were like, we're out of cards. We're filling all these cards. And he was like 4 hours in. And I was like, Steve, we gotta stop. But it also didn't surprise me. After we stopped, he started telling me how much he loved AOC. Batya is the same. People sort of left MAGA types. But on the Gramsci thing, Gramsci spent most of the important part of his life in jail, right? I mean, it was like 1922 or 23 to when he died, which I think the late 30s, 37, 38.
I think he was in jail until he started jail, I think in 24, and got out on medical mercy kind of thing, like 35 or 36 or something. And then died like 2 years later or a year later.
And he had become slightly hostile to Stalin. So, but that's the thing always with communist intellectuals. It's why people, refer to themselves as Trotskyites, and even sometimes Lenin, because they just weren't around for the bad stuff. I mean, despite the fact that Trotsky did run the Red Army during the Civil War and was guilty of countless atrocities against white forces that they captured and executed. But
Lenin was responsible for all sorts of grisly, horrible murders, including a friend. So, I mean, I actually posted. I don't tweet very much because I find the whole place too crazy and toxic. But I did probably one of the last 5 tweets I tweeted, and I don't remember the context. It might have been about this: the Lenin hanging order that was dug out of the archives by Richard Pipes in the early 90s, 92, a very brief period when the archives were open. Yale had a series called the Annals of Communism series. And it was because the archives had opened. It was Jonathan Brent, I think, who was the editor of everything there. Might be.
And Pipes wrote a book called The Unknown Lenin. To kind of dispel all this stuff. He's like, well, Lenin's, he's incapacitated and out of the scene by 1924. So, everything, Stalin stuff's not his fault, but he had the right ideas. And you realize the brutality. But that's the stuff I think that informs a lot of these guys, that you can dress it up in all sort of, well, Gramsci attacked the syndicalists for this reason, and he didn't speak out about Matteotti's murder from Mussolini in 25 or whatever that was. you can get all the specifics of that stuff, but essentially it's like they want to blow up the institution. And that's what these guys said that they wanted to do too. So therefore, let me be a bit transgressive and say that my inspiration is a communist intellectual that was jailed by Mussolini. Isn't that interesting? And I think that that's a lot of it, because you can find other people who have less of a footprint, because Gramsci is like Chomsky in the sense, Chomsky, Marx, Gramsci are probably the three most cited people in academic papers. I think Chomsky was for a long time. Marx is always up there, and Gramsci is too. And so to grab these people, but it's probably better. It's like we're talking about, if it's not Hitler, who is he like? Is it Juan Perón? Is it a Chavista type? I don't think that Chris Rufo, despite the fact that I think he's a bright guy and I think that he understands a lot of these issues, but just watching him, you know, I've seen he has an enormous feud with my co-host Camille Foster. And they just don't like each other, and they've been arguing about this stuff for a long time. And when he basically says, we lost this battle because we were following the rules, but they don't follow the rules, so we can no longer follow the rules either. And that's when you get to stuff like, we're revolutionaries, we're destroy the system types. Because if you go within the system, then what happens? We lose the culture war, and now we're fighting dirty, and we're winning the culture war. DEI was everywhere. We're fighting dirty. Donald Trump is destroying DEI, right? I mean, the George Floyd moment, people are getting canceled, people are getting fired. Amazon is putting a black square, and you can filter your businesses by, you know, by their skin tone. It's like the paper bag test of who you buy from. And that's crazy, and that's gone. And that the case that they make is, you know, it's because we stopped fighting fair. And if you want to do it your way, if you want to value free speech, if you want to say that the kid at Columbia, or any of these kids that, you know, they're Palestinian activists and it's about their speech, no, they're terrorists, let's get rid of them, and it's going to benefit us and our cause in the long run. I just don't buy that. And I think that there's always, it's cocaine. You know, you always need more. It's always enjoyable until then it's not, until it comes and destroys your life. And I think this stuff can come back and destroy everybody. And it's a cliche, boring thing to say, but the second that the Democrats get their shit together and get a president back in the White House, George Bush became, you know, this is the sort of accumulation of a bit of executive power. Everyone's freaking out about it, you know, Gene Healy and Cato, the imperial presidency, and then Obama comes and it's a bit more, and now we're here. So what happens with the next administration that's Democratic? Because if you see these numbers as they're going, and if the economy, you know, we haven't even seen the real effects of this stuff yet. I mean, it's going to be baked in for a couple of months. What happens then when they have the institutions? You don't think they can take them back, particularly when they have everyone in academia, in Hollywood? It's like they're already in those power positions. Now you've given them more power to do the stuff that they were doing before.
More permission. Yeah.
No, more permission is right. Yeah.
I agree with all of that. The mode of analysis that bothers me in part, or one of the things that bothers me, is, so this is cliched K Street term, or a line among rainmakers. And the rule is, when it rains, dance. And the point is that when something breaks the way of your client, take credit for it, regardless of whether you had anything to do with it, right? And I think that there's been, again, stipulated Rufo has been effective at, you know, the margins, or on this fight or that fight, whatever. You know, like, I'm not a huge close student, but I'm happy to stipulate, to be honest. Yeah. So, but and let's stipulate that some of the other people who are at the tip of the spear of the backlash against DEI and wokeness have been effective in various battles. Ron DeSantis and whoever certainly has been effective. The problem I have with the analysis is that people want to make it seem like, but for these people deploying these tactics, the left would have kept winning, when in fact the whole reason why these people could win these fights is because the left went too far. Yeah. People got exhausted with their nonsense. And so they became easy targets for political opportunists I don't mean political opportunities in a bad way. I just mean
Sure,
people
yeah.
seizing an opportunity to push back, right? And so
it's a very good point. It's a very good point.
And then they take all the credit for it as if, oh, this is all about a battle of ideas. No, it's because like Americans got really tired of this garbage, and they voted for people who said they were going to put an end to this garbage. You didn't persuade them; the facts persuaded them, and that this gets that what we talked about before. I talk about it here all the time. The way in which intellectuals want to believe that ideas drive everything, when sometimes the ideas are actually the lagging indicators.
Yeah.
And there are other things going on.
The media does the same thing when they say,
sure,
we can't put this person on because we'll change the election. And I have to say, no one's paying attention to you. You know, that's a very similar thing. But no, I think it's a very, very good point. And one that is really not appreciated. And the one thing I noticed when I spent 4+ years going to Trump rallies and filming at Trump rallies and talking to people and meeting some absolutely lovely people who I thought were misguided on certain things, but they were always very generous and very nice. And I always make the comment that you'd be in the press pen and they'd boo you when Donald Trump said, you know, the fake news media. And then if they had seen something that you had done when you come outside, they're like, oh, let's take a picture and let's do this. And they were always very, it was professional wrestling, right?
Yeah.
And the one thing that I said to my producer one time, I'll never forget this, we were at a rally and we'd heard it so many times. And some guy had said to me, we were shooting, and he said, you know, I'm really tired of just like being the white guy and being called a racist. I just want this, that, and the other. And I said to my producer when I got in the car, I said, I guarantee you no one's ever done that to him. But the spirit is real. I mean, that it's not, he's seen that with other people, but they internalize it. And they were like, I'm voting for him because he's the only person that understands that, you know, we're just like working class white people and people call us racist for X, Y, and Z reasons. And, you know, I'm called a racist all the time because I like Donald Trump, but I'm not a racist. I guarantee you no one's ever called this person a racist. I guarantee you he doesn't, you know, associate with that many people on a daily basis outside of work. And, you know, but that feeling was because, as you point out, is that the overreach was so great in the, how do I have evidence of that beyond just what you see with your own two eyes? Well, it's hosting a podcast. And we have at the Fifth Column a very good mix of people on the left and the right. Now, we've lost a lot of people, by the way. Since Trump came. They're like, why are you guys have Trump derangement syndrome? It's like, no, we're just being consistent and pointing this stuff out. But what we got in the past 4 or 5 years was endless numbers of emails from people that said, and you will notice if you listen to the podcast, when we do the paid episodes, which we do like a mailbag, we never read anyone's names. We say, you know, John S. or John, because we got so used to people saying, don't read my name. I don't want to be associated with any of this stuff ever. And then when we started getting things from people that you would know, like famous people, like Hollywood people, like musicians. I got an interesting one the other day of somebody, I'm like, wow, really? You've been a listener to the podcast? And it's like, yeah, because that time was so crazy. And I felt that you guys weren't really MAGA and super ideological about these things. Sometimes you go to these flights of fancy about markets and the rest of it. And, you're talking about knock and who the fuck is knock? Like, no, I get it. But there would be these kind of moments. It was like a therapeutic thing. They were like, these people have gone so far that in my world, in my universe, I just don't feel like I can be honest about things that I find that most Americans believe. And that was the thing that was always really important. It was not as if you had a fringe view, that you were somebody on, from American History X, you were some kind of neo-Nazi. There were people that said, if you look at these, like the trans thing is an interesting one, because it's like, it's like an 80-20 issue.
Yeah.
And you had to be in the 20 to say anything publicly. And and for us, that was good for our listenership. And then it helped you explain the Donald Trump stuff. But it also, I think, to the mandate issue, you have 50% of the people that are out there to vote for Donald Trump, right? Those numbers are down to 40, 39. What's that mandate now? Is the mandate elastic? Because the people who voted for him because they hated this shit are like, wait, tariffing 150%? What? Well, this is crazy. The markets are responding to like in this crazy schizophrenic way. So yeah, I mean, I think that's to your point, is that victory was going to happen anyway. Maybe people that were culture warriors sped it up, but I think that you're right that it was going in that direction anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of like you are not some brilliant, incredibly persuasive person to make the, I don't mean you particularly, no one is like to say, hey, taxpayer funded transitions for illegal immigrant prisoners.
Yeah.
Like
by the way, when I found out that was actually real, I was like, that can't be real.
I know, I was too.
That's a Charlie Kirk fever dream.
No, I always think of it as like, how you play these games with people where you try to test where their limiting principles are?
Yeah.
And so like, and I used to love doing it with libertarians about censorship stuff. But on the trans rights stuff, you'd be like, okay, are you for trans rights? Yes, I'm for trans rights. Okay, are you for trans rights? And you keep ratcheting up the preposterousness of it from the reasonable for trans rights. That's okay. That's people can have their perfectly legitimate point of view. So you think taxpayers should? How about taxpayer funded transition surgeries for American citizens? Yes, I'm for it. Okay. How about for illegal immigrants? Yes. Like at some point, you're just supposed to say, there's a limit to my generosity on this issue.
Fentanyl dealers. No, I mean it's no, that's absolutely right. And I have to say that I think that the masterstroke of that campaign was the ad with Charlemagne the God. Sure. I mean, it was I know, again, that's kind of a cliche thing to say, but, specifically getting Charlemagne on that, taking that clip of him when you have all this polling that's coming back and saying, we're making big inroads with minorities. And this is one culture war issue that we think will resonate with them. Choosing that clip, it's like, that was well done. But, culture war issues aren't going to buy your groceries. So that we'll see how sustainable this presidency is. I just seems like
so that sort of makes, but that's a good point. It makes it, but it dovetails with a point I've been making about the voters that you're supposed to look at are that median voter, right? The majority maker voter, because Trump was going to get 44% of the electorate no matter what, right? So that 7 points that he gets, called 7 points to get to 51, even though he got to 48, whatever, right? Yeah. To make it easier. Those last 7 points, that's where your real mandate is, because those are the people who are going to vote for you only because they think you're the better alternative to somebody else they might vote for, right? And those people are like the Hispanic mechanic who got murdered by inflation and COVID, right?
Yeah.
They are not for wholesale mass deportations. They are not for subsidized transgender surgery. I mean, like the median voter is like this pivot voter. And I think the genius of that ad, right? The people who are against trans, no matter what the question is, they're part of that 44%. Trump was going to get the anti-trans vote no matter what.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
The people that ad was effective for to get that last 7% were the people who read it not as an anti-trans ad, but as she's just one of those people who just does what these crazy campus leftists want her to do, and she doesn't care about working people like me. And like, that's the real power of that ad, is this idea that Trump was going to be focused on people's actual concerns. And that's the mandate that he is just pissing on from a great height.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. I mean, the thing that I'm, wondering, and look at that very idea of this kind of disparate group of views that people have when they're that 7, 8 points that Trump needs for the victory. It's what got me interested in politics. I remember the cliche thing that a college student pops into their brain. You try to figure it out. It's like, why, if I want lower taxes, should it mean that I have a particular view on abortion or guns? I mean, that's the thing that, when you're 19 years old, you try to figure out. And it's weird that lesson has not been learned by people within the political class, and, people trying to win elections or trying to sustain the Trump victory, because I don't know what these people have in common. I mean, Christopher Hitchens in 2004 outraged everybody at The Nation because he had been making fun of George Bush and the malapropisms, which he loved to point out, and the rest of it. And he said, I'm a one-issue guy. I'm just voting on Iraq, which is amazing to think about now.
Yeah.
But there are people that were like single-issue voters in this election, and when those issues kind of feel like they're in the rearview mirror, where do they go? What do they do? I mean, Christopher wanted John Edwards to be president. That was weird that he just hated the Clintons. But like, there's a lot of people, that I've spoken to when I was out reporting on this stuff who were, this is a funny thing that everyone always said the same thing. I don't like the tweeting. That was back in they were like, I really don't like the tweeting, but it was like they had to acknowledge that he was kind of a piece of shit.
Yeah.
It was the throat clearing, like, I'm not one of those people. And I'm like, you are wearing American flag pants and an enormous picture of Donald Trump on your chest. I get it. You don't like tweeting. But that kind of thing is, where do those people go, and how do they sustain it? And I just don't you see the polling on like the Ukraine war stuff. I had conversations, debates with people about the Zelensky meeting, and I thought I was like, was I on mescaline when that was happening? Are we watching the same thing? Like, he did Zelensky beclowned himself, whatever. But the American people didn't think that was good. If you look at the polling about that, they don't think any of that stuff is good. And, on an issue by issue basis, I mean, where was he? He was doing great on the economy. That's where he dominated. And now he is going to destroy the economy. I didn't get to say this the other night. We were on the podcast talking about this. Oh, there's these big problems. What should we do? This was the big fight we had with Bacha. Well, what would you do? And I said, well, no, we're talking about what Trump's doing. I'm not the president, so let's talk about that. And I realized afterwards the esprit d'escalier of this was that the economy of January 19th was fine. Mm-hmm. That was good. That was better than this. I mean, that's what I would want, to go back to that. Yeah, you have to change things on the margins, of course. That's why I'm interested in politics and I'm interested in economics. But as a starting point, that would be where I'd like to be, rather than, well, we got the Japanese to the table. It's like, you care about trade deficits. We had a trade surplus with the Japanese. What are you talking about? Like, this is all insane. So it's just, it's a very hard time to be interested in this stuff, isn't it?
So I have an interesting question for you. So like, you're libertarian and libertarian adjacent, right? So,
adjacent, yeah.
But and I'm libertarian adjacent, but I'm also conservative. Still clinging to the term conservative while it still has some of its historic meaning. But one thing that you and I have kind of emphasized, which I think intellectuals, I mean, I bristle, I hate calling myself an intellectual, but like, this is the life we've chosen. Intellectuals value, let's put it this way. Many intellectuals put a high premium on intellectual consistency.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you and I are like on this. We beat up Biden, we beat up Trump. We're free traders when Republicans are in charge and when Democrats are in charge, right? Correct. That kind of stuff, right? And I think the flip side of that is that we are freaked out by other intellectuals, idea merchants, right? Whatever you want to call them, who are not consistent. And we end up judging them very harshly. I mean, anytime I'm speaking for you that you think I'm wrong, chime in. But like,
no, so far I agree with everything.
We tend to judge them harshly because they are violating a principle that we think is really important, which is that our principles and our ideas do not change based on the outcome of an election necessarily, right? And so part of the problem with intellectuals who change is they have to come up with, what got me thinking about this was your point about when you're 19 trying to figure out why, if I'm for lower taxes, or I have to be against abortion, right? Intellectuals have to come up with a coherent theory of the case for why they have a new position. So Victor Davis Hanson, who has lots of different positions over time, each time it's an internally coherent thing, but they're just not coherent over time when you compare them to his different positions. Similarly, but the thing is, I struggle with this because I see, first of all, what happens to intellectuals when, because of politics, they change their position and end up defenestrating so much of their, intellectual integrity in the process.
Sure.
And at the same time, the average voter, that median voter that we're talking about, is not particularly concerned with consistency, right?
Yeah.
It's not, intellectual consistency is not like a huge thing for them. And it makes me wonder whether or not the the desire for consistency, which I think is one of the things that has driven a lot of people to redefine what they mean by good character so that they can say that Donald Trump is awesome, is one of the things that can be debilitating for intellectuals, because you need to come up with an answer for why there are no contradictions in your current position that you can't explain. And that process is the thing that kind of corrupts people. Does that make any sense?
It does. I think the difference is, you know, you can always see with the intellectuals exactly why it's happening, right? I mean, you know, I said Stephen Moore, Larry Kudlow, these people who, Art Laffer. I interviewed Art Laffer for this free trade documentary I did, and you know, I could tell that he didn't believe what he was saying, and it kind of felt like in between shooting that he was kind of indicating that you know, he wanted some influence in the administration, so therefore trade was his views on trade had changed pretty quickly. I think with the average voter,
I hate that so much, but yeah,
yeah. I mean, but with the average voter, it's situational to their own. You know, like somebody has, you know, makes $50,000 a year. They start a plumbing company, and now they're making $800,000 a year, and they're paying payroll taxes. And like, you know, they don't have to have the intellectual consistency of like, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat. It's like, this just benefits me now. I didn't think about this before. Whereas, you know, intellectuals that, you know, I said something to a woman a long time ago. I've mentioned this on the podcast. My great love life advice I gave to a friend of mine. She had this guy that she was dating, and he was amazing. He was going to the theater, and they, you know, he was an art guy, and they went to museums together. And I said to her, he's hiding the video games. And she said, what do you mean? I said, go to his house. He's got all the smart books out, and that PlayStation is shoved right under the couch. And she said to me about 3 months later, she said, he hid the video games. Of course. And that is the thing with intellectuals, when this is your job, hiding the video games in this context is that I thought you believed something. And it turned out you were just trying to impress me. And then when you got the opportunity to get closer to power, and you just changed that tune, whereas it's offensive to people like you and me because we do this because we believe things. And this has been a very consistent thing that I've been talking about for the past year, particularly amongst Republicans, is to discover that none of them believe in anything. And you know, this is like the Big Lebowski. It's like they don't believe in anything, man. You know, that's kind of how I've seen these people that you know, if we value consistency because we spend our lives coming up with the reasons that we believe things, or believing things because we've gone through all these reasons, not sort of backfilling it. But when you can change that just to get a little bit closer to power. I mean, the thing about Tucker Carlson is the thing that everybody says. I'll say a great thing about Ann Coulter, by the way, is she believes everything. She's the Trump administration the first time around, she was like, he's great. In Trump we trust. And then 2 years later, she's literally tweeting Donald Trump is a retard. Like an actual thing from Ann Coulter. It is that Ann Coulter, like, no, she believes that stuff. She is actually that person. Tucker, I have no idea. How can you go so quickly between those things if it's not power, if it's not proximity to power, if it's not money? I mean, he's obviously printing money in audience capture, and is very similar to these people on Capitol Hill who said, I mean, what is the Freedom Caucus now versus what it was during the Tea Party? I mean,
but I agree with all. I guess I agree with that, and I also think it's different cases for different people, right?
Sure,
but all that kind of stuff. But my point is, and I just hadn't really thought about it through. It's like, so Yuval Levin has made a very good case that I generally agree with, that cynicism is really, really hard to maintain.
Yes.
That it can be a gateway drug, but then you have to convince yourself you're doing things for high-minded reasons, right? Yeah. And we saw this with a lot of people with Trump. Just go back to 2015, 2016, the number of people that we both know who said he's the lesser of two evils, right? Can't vote for Hillary, you know, like maybe not the hardcore Flight 93 BS, but like this sort of like, he's got to be better than her, but he's an idiot, and, you know, who knows, right? That kind of stuff. Who 6 months later are talking about what a genius Trump is.
Yes.
And all that kind of stuff. And that's the point I'm kind of getting at. Like, I know from several different people, like Hannity in 2015, early 2016, was telling people, or whatever the time, early on, was telling people, like during commercial breaks, Trump's an idiot, but look, he's a great stalking horse, a blocking tackle for Ted Cruz, and he's a lot of fun. And then 6 months later, he would be saying during commercial breaks, you know, under Comrade Trump, we're going to have the greatest wheat harvest we've ever seen east of the Urals, right? I mean, and he believed it. And that's the thing, is that's the process. You go from, and I do not think that Sean Hannity is an intellectual, but it's the same process where cynicism gets you to switch, partisanship gets you to switch. And then, because there's something about our lizard brains that says, I cannot be the kind of person who celebrates a bad person as my leader. So I must, for the sake of my own integrity, and integrity is basically another word for intellectual consistency. I mean, when you think about what the integrity actually means, holistic, hold together, all that kind of stuff, they come up with new narratives to justify their new position. And so you see some of the most ridiculous arguments for Trumpism coming from the most intellectual people, because they can't just say what a normie person can say, what that median voter can say. It was like,
yes,
he's going to cut my taxes, or like, I think Kamala Harris would be terrible for Israel, or you know, I stinking hate the woke left. Trump's an idiot. They can't bring the intellectuals can't, because that's not an intellectual answer.
Yeah,
and that's the corrupting thing, is it makes you commit to, like, no, Stalin is actually a really great guy and he cares about the little guy, because, like,
well, I mean, the greatest example of this is how so many people in the Republican Party, and you look at the polls, and it's so alarming to see, because, you know, what comes out on Fox News and what comes out on, you know, One America and Newsmax and stuff, is how people on the right think about Russia. Yeah. That is the biggest flip, and it is inexplicable. And there's no obvious thing. Well, you know, Yeltsin was a disaster, but hopeful. And, you know, but Putin really got things in order. And, you know, Navalny might be a casualty, but you don't make an omelet, et cetera. This is something that is purely reacting to the kind of conservative media complex and people within politics. It is so stunning to me that, you know, I, in my lifetime, would be surprised if any Republican or conservative that I was talking to would be defending Ukraine. Because Ukraine, I mean, I just don't think this was, it doesn't feel like it was the case maybe 20, 30 years ago, because there was a lot more consistency, right? There was kind of an intellectual core to, like, Reaganism, for instance. And you'd have these schisms, and you'd have Pat Buchanan and things like that. You know, he's the kind of text of all of this stuff for the modern version of it. But now it just, the method of transmitting these ideas is so fast, and so, like, you don't want to be on the wrong side of things if you're on Twitter, right? I mean, I have heard more things about you, like, people, like, you decided, like, I'm going to stick with this is what I believe. In doing so, people decided that they loathed you. This was going to be a thing. You are this avatar of everything is wrong with this party and with this fake conservatism, et cetera. And when I see the Russia stuff, it's like, how am I arguing with you about who was responsible for the invasion of Ukraine? When, you know, I was reading, because I'm writing something, there's a long thing I'm writing about this, and it's been forever, about the idea of history and historiography. And I was reading Richard Evans's book, and a guy I have a lot of problems with, by the way. But I wrote a book about on history, and it's very quaint now, because there's a bit where he's like, you know, we all agree on the facts here, right? So there's a set of facts, but it's just how we interpret them, and let's go into why we interpret them in different and ideological ways, a Marxist way, right-wing way, et cetera. And it's like, no, that's not even true. Right. I mean, the president is literally saying that the Ukrainians started this war, and you're like, what is happening? Like, what has happened to this entire movement? And that's when you start using the C word. This is a cult. And because what the dear leader says, they will follow. And you know, the thing that became so embarrassing to see, oh, you have the Ukrainian flag in your bio. Well, yeah, that might be a bit cringe for reasons that have nothing to do with Ukraine being invaded by the Russians, but it's like that was a marker that you were a bad person.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized that nothing makes sense anymore. And I'll tell you what, I'm not giving myself any credit, patting myself on the back, but Matt and Camille and I in the Fifth Column have understood that if we go on Megyn Kelly's show all the time. Megyn and I and all of us disagree on a lot, but she's been very generous to us and says, we're like her libertarian sparring partners, and we were yelling about tariffs and stuff last time. But it'd be very, very easy to lean into that enormous audience and make a shitload of money. And they have a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's just I just don't know how you sleep if that's how you're making your money. I mean, talk about Tim Pool. Tim Pool worked at Vice when I was there. And he was the Occupy Wall Street guy. Now, what we should say, too, when we're talking about this stuff, people are allowed to change their minds over time. And that's not what we're talking about. I know that's not what I'm talking about, is that people shift. This is not Michael Lind. This is Michael Lind started the National Review, right? And then, God knows where he is now. But there are a lot of people that change their minds in a Whittaker Chambers kind of way. I don't think Whittaker Chambers literally said, I'm leaving the winning side for the losing side. It was the most wrong thing he ever said. But he believed that, and he did that out of principle, and his life was, of course, ruined. There was a book that came out literally last week saying that Chambers, Jeff Kisseloff or whatever, saying Chambers' whole life was a fantasy and a lie. I mean, you walk into it for forever.
So it's funny. I have this piece. I'm waiting to get a galley back from my poor beleaguered editor at the Dispatch. We have these Monday essays, which are like bigger deal. And I decided to do one on the difference, how this is not the first moment. And this is really a terrible, at 1:21 into this conversation, it's a terrible time to bring
this is
up.
What Matt calls a French goodbye. Yeah.
Yeah. But it is not a new thing in American life for the distinction between right wing and conservative to be very pronounced. But it has never been more pronounced insofar as the populist right now. There's always been populism on the right.
Yeah.
Right? There's always been part of the coalition, but it's never been the ascendant part. It has never been the part that owns the commanding heights of the party and of conservatism. Now, between Fox News and the Republican Party being Trumpy, the populists run the thing, and they're doing purges. And part of my point, we'll see what ends up in the final thing, but part of the point is that, and you made me think about this with the Whittaker Chambers thing. Whittaker Chambers in Witness talks about the popular front mind.
Yeah.
Right. And among conservative and libertarian eggheads, popular front thinking is one of the ancient sins, right? This idea that you can have, the famous French phrase is no enemies to the left, right? But it is this idea that you need to subordinate your principles and your views for the good of the cause and the movement, when really what the Popular Front was a exercise in coalition management that gave breathing room to Stalinists. And then whenever the Stalinists had the upper hand, they were viciously exterminationist against the other members of their coalition, right? It was sort of like tolerance for me, I'm coming for you, mother effer, for thee. And that is how the new right is operating. It is, how dare you what about Reagan's 11th commandment when you criticize them, but we're going to primary you and destroy your career, and you're going to have to live with it, ha ha ha, and cancel culture for the Reagan, the zombie Reaganists and all of these kinds of people. But how dare you call anybody deplorable? How dare you say Trump's wrong about anything? And that popular front mentality, which I think is so manifest on Fox News, and never mind its lesser imitators, is the death of intellectual seriousness. Where the thing I think that made the right successful, why Whittaker Chambers was wrong, is because people like us would argue with each other, and arguments are good. Arguments keep you healthy. They're the antibodies of intellectual life. And the debates between conservatives and libertarians, between neocons and paleocons and all these kinds of these knockdown, drag out fights that we had a tolerance for and the left didn't, are why the left got atrophied and succumbed to groupthink and why the right developed better arguments. And now the right, in very short order, is succumbing to this sort of popular front, mindset, which says you cannot for the sake of power, you cannot tolerate disagreement on our side and no enemies to the right. And that's horseshit, and I'm never going to go with it.
I mean, I think it's a very good point. And when, again, we talk about what does this movement look like, and I'll say that it is nothing like this in its actual political manifestation up until 1953. But there is that Stalinist thing that you're waiting for the ideas from Moscow. If it's we support Putin in this and not the Ukrainians, despite the fact that the Ukrainians were themselves invaded. It is how you think about the invasion of Finland. It is about how you think about the pact. And that made a lot of people leave the party, right? Mm-hmm. That there was a bunch of people that how you thought about the purge trials in 37, 38, et cetera. And, Hollywood making movies supporting the purge trials, Michael Curtiz, who made Casablanca, making a movie about this. And then there's the people that leave, and that's you, and that's a number of other people within the kind of conservative firmament. But you see, that's Stalinism. Why did that die, and why does it always die, and why will it eventually die? It is because they spend so much time destroying each other. And how did Nazis come to power? Because the Social Democrats and the KPD were killing each other, and they were not. It's the Spanish Civil War problem. The syndicalists are fighting the POUM, and the POUM are fighting the. It's just no one's paying attention to Franco, right? And they're spending all their time purging. And guess what? The Democrats are weak. They're not putting up much of a resistance. No one's really focusing on them. They spent 4 years focusing on the horrors of Biden, and I believe Biden was a terrible president. We were lied to about all of this stuff. But right now, it's like when you have that kind of runaway power, and you are looking, because, it was thanks to, Harvey Clare and John Earl Haynes and people like that said, the CPUSA was really run by Moscow and was getting money from Moscow. Sure. And they were like, this is, Browderism must end. Like people who think about this, Browderism, what the fuck is that? But Browderism must end is, what these kind of little epistles that go back and forth to people within the movement and say, you're out. Once you do that, and I think the funny thing is that we were talking about this Dave Smith guy and, responding. Again, I didn't watch this. I honestly, goodness didn't. I don't like watching stuff like that. We have Vachi on the show last night, and in the description of the podcast, I said, we screamed at each other, but we remain friends. And, we were fine on the way out. And I think she's wrong about everything, and she knows that. And I spent 2 hours saying that. But, it's a civil kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, I think you're wrong about this. I think the new thing that is this the venom that you see from people who disagree with you. Mm-hmm. And that is the kind of Dave Smith. There's so much like, you are not this. The only place I saw that before, by the way, with any consistency, libertarianism. Because libertarians were always like purging. You're not a real. When I worked at Reason, I couldn't read the comments because it was each different version of "you're not a real libertarian."
The Lou Rockwell, Ron Paul universe was just bonkers,
which is now transcendent and in the White House in a lot of ways. Yeah, and and I won't make this the French goodbye, but something to think about. Maybe we should talk about in the future. Is that my contention is it is a possibility that one of the next casualties. Donald Trump is actually pushing back against this. Will be the support for Israel amongst Republicans, because there's a big movement amongst people, and you see that with these purges in Defense Department of Laura Loomer, a mentally ill 9/11 truther, goes in to Donald Trump and gives him a list of people reported by multiple sources and said these are the people in the National Security Council that have to be fired or purged. The NSA, and then it was a National Security Council, and then they fire 5 people, a couple of whom I know. So, which I guess she was right.
No, I think you're right. Brett Stevens has been making this point too about how, like, there can come a time where Israelis really rue Donald Trump's success, but we can get to that another time.
Yeah.
And I'll just do my French goodbye on you by saying, because you're one of the only people who appreciate it. I have all of these receipts about the history of neoconservatism that my listeners are just so bored with. But one of the things you'd always used to hear from paleocons, from paleolibertarians, from all of these sort of esoteric groups that hated the quote unquote neocons was that Irving Kristol and like Nat Glazer or something were closeted Trotskyites.
Yeah.
And that neoconservatism was really a Trojan horse to bring Trotskyism to the right. I think it was all garbage. These guys were college students, Trotskyites, for like 5 minutes. Meanwhile, James Burnham was one of Lenin's Trotsky's best friends, and he's a translator, and he was an editor of the Daily Worker. And Max Eastman was literary. All of these communists around. Whittaker Chambers was a freaking communist spy, and
the editor of New Masses. Yeah.
So, like, put all that aside. I just think it is weird how I am, and this doesn't come from Rufo, but like Rufo and a handful of other these guys elevate an Italian Stalinist who was loyal to Moscow as their lodestar in ways that Irving Kristol never would have about Trotsky. And people are like, oh, you just don't get it. Like, you know, this is, you don't understand power and all this kind of stuff. And these are the heirs of the same sort of faction that would say you can't trust this Nebuchadnezzar Jewish intellectual because for 5.5 minutes in the 1930s, when he was in college, he liked the guy who was against Stalin in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I just find it's a weird little sort of inconsistency that it grates at me. It's the pea in the mattress kind of thing. So,
well, I want to say congratulations on getting SCOTUS blog. Considering while we were recording this, alert just popped up that Kash Patel says the FBI arrested a Wisconsin judge on obstruction charges. So that's where I don't know what
I wonder. There was a judge somewhere who had an illegal immigrant in their home.
Yeah, Hannah. This is Patel wrote that the FBI believes Milwaukee Circuit Court Judge Hannah Dugan, quote, intentionally misdirected federal agents away from Eduardo Flores Ruiz as agents were attempting to arrest him at her courthouse last week.
All right. Well,
there we go. I don't know the details of it, but
good times.
Times. That's where we are.
In 3 weeks, when you're drinking puddle water in a bottom of a bunker, you can think, you know, it's funny. The first time I heard about this judge thing, which set off all these events, was I was on Goldberg's podcast. So anyway, Michael Moynihan, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Jonah. I always enjoy it.